It's my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, my colleague, John Litynski. He's the Senior Advisor to the School of Energy Resources. He most recently served as the Director of Carbon Transport and Storage at DOE's Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. He has more than 25 years of experience working on environmental compliance, carbon sequestration, and technology development for the energy sector. And we're really lucky because John has decided to live in Wyoming. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you for the organizers of the conference. I know I do have some slides. There we go. Perfect. So yeah, I came to Wyoming 2 years ago when I was working for DOE. It was a great opportunity to come out west. It was actually near the end of COVID. They moved me out because we had a lot of stakeholders out here. And then they offered me early retirement. And it was a great place to land at the University School of Energy Resources. They really gave me an opportunity, incredible group of people to work with, and they're doing incredible things. Wyoming is just one of those places that actually gets things done, and the entire state and the government is behind that. And so it really has been a pleasure working at SCR. I'm going to give you just a little bit more of kind of a background of where at least 5 months ago, and I just looked on public websites on where DOE is in terms of spending money, but I also want to frame what the challenge is, because the amount of infrastructure that's going to be built or needed for carbon management is substantial. It is truly an industry that's going to have to scale at a very rapid pace to meet some of the climate goals that at least this administration is talking about. But a lot of the customers in the states that are Wyoming, because you're energy exporters, really have to meet some of the demands of some of those states that are looking to decarbonize themselves. So these are just some of the topics I'll go through, talk about the infrastructure requirements. I really think the fact that Wyoming has a really successful Class 2 program for EOR has set a foundation for the rapid growth of CCS and carbon management in the state. I'll talk about some of the funding opportunities and drivers that federal government has put out there, or at least are managing and trying to implement at this point. There's a lot of complementary Wyoming funding opportunity announcements, and obviously you need to cost share a lot of the federal agreements. So it's important to have these, and I think the state has really stepped up from my view. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about community benefits and how it's being implemented, some of the drivers for implementation, some of the impacts of the funding, and some of the impacts on the funding. So I'll talk just a few personal viewpoints on that. So if you look at the infrastructure that needs to be built, at least just for CCS, it is significant. They're talking about going from a program that actually transports in the United States, mostly for EOR, maybe 70 to 80 million tons of CO2, to moving, 1 billion to 2 billion tons of CO2 around the United States and injecting it into saline storage reservoirs or for enhanced oil or gas recovery. Significant industry, lots of jobs, lots of investments, billions to trillions of dollars of investment in this. If you look globally, you're talking about 8, maybe more billion tons of CO2 needing to be injected to meet the goals. There is no economic way to actually meet net zero goals without CCS. I'm just saying, you look at all the models, even out of the White House and some of the reports on the pathways to decarbonization, they say 1 billion tons of CO2 needs to be injected to meet net zero. So CCS, carbon management, is going to be critical to decarbonization of the United States and internationally. So the United States put out a report out of the White House, essentially a pathways to net zero, set up to a gigaton of CO2 or more, 1.5 needed to be injected to meet these net zero goals. And it is clear, with the promulgation, or at least the release for comment of the greenhouse gas standards for fossil fuel power plants, they are relying on CCS to decarbonize the electricity sector. That doesn't count other sectors such as industrial or potentially direct air capture. So again, setting the stage on scale, if you look out into 2050, some of the analysis shows that you're going to need to actually build 1,500 CCS facilities around the United States to meet this goal. That is a massive amount of infrastructure, steel, pipe, wells in the ground to actually meet this demand. This is the Petronova facility. It's only a fraction of the power plant emissions that are coming off of that facility. It just was restarted, I think, recently. You're talking about thousands of these types of facilities, but it scales 4 to 5 times the size of this facility to be built. Pipeline and storage resources. There's a lot of groups out there that have said, okay, this is what the landscape's going to look like by 2050. Tens of thousands of miles of pipeline, lots of steel. We need storage capacities, commercial storage capacities to store 30 to 50 gigatons of CO2. We need thousands of wells permitted and operational to meet these goals. None of these probably future projections are right in the details, but they're probably right in terms of the scale and magnitude that needs to be deployed. And I think that's what's important. You can see there's only a little sliver in Wyoming. Again, they just may not have the data to actually say what is going to happen in Wyoming. I personally think Wyoming is a great opportunity to actually deploy CCS. You have pipeline corridors, you've got lots of oil and gas experience, a lot of EOR opportunities, a lot of good saline storage reservoirs. So, maybe you need to collaborate with some of these national modelers, or maybe you don't really, because I don't think you need to. Industry recognizes the opportunities in Wyoming, and a lot of companies are coming to Wyoming to develop CCS already. And then just setting the stage, last thing, they're already leaning in on this, but Wyoming's benefit or having a CO2 industry already is paying off. You've got pipeline corridors, you have pipelines, you've got active CO2 injection projects, you've got a business mindset to actually make this happen. And, I think leaning in on that, whether you look for class 2 or class 6 permits, you have a business environment to facilitate carbon management across the state. So I'll talk about the funding opportunity announcements. I'm really just going to focus on these first set of funding opportunity announcements. If you review the federal budget, 1, the request to Congress, and then 2, Congress's appropriations and the appropriations reports, you will see carbon management embedded across multiple agencies. So I'm going to primarily talk about DOE, but if you're really interested, I'd look at USDA, DOI, National Science Foundation, EPA. All of them are getting funding either for research or to support deployment of, carbon management, not just CCS throughout the United States, because they're all chasing this goal to help decarbonize basically the economy by 2050 and get to net zero. Whether you agree with that goal or not, that's irrelevant. The money, the policies are there, and they're pushing them to be implemented. The other BIL funded programs that I won't talk about in detail, hydrogen hubs. There was just an announcement this morning, on the selections of the first round of the hydrogen hubs for negotiation, industrial demonstrations, decarbonization. It is all about reducing CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. CCS is included in that also. There's $6.3 billion for that as well. And then clean energy demonstrations on former mine lands. This could be solar, wind, CCS deployment, DAC deployment on former mine lands, potentially an opportunity for Wyoming as well. Won't talk about that in detail, but again, lots of opportunities for funding for projects. So large scale pilots, $937 million. The DOE had been supporting the development of CCS technologies for transformational carbon capture systems probably for 20 years. They just started to scale those up and have a number of technologies from the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management that are ready to go to large scale pilot. That large scale pilot is critical to commercialization of a technology. If you don't get to a 10, 20 megawatt system, there's a lot of scaling issues that you really can't overcome and just model, at the 1 megawatt to 250 or 300 megawatts. So right now they're reviewing full applications. They were submitted on June 21st. There was probably, I can't remember, I think maybe 30 letters of interest. I don't remember the right numbers, but over 10 applications that are under full review. One of them specifically, great, be successful, is considering testing in Wyoming. I can't talk about who it is, but these are large systems. If you look in the bottom right-hand corner, this is just an image of a feed study and an image of a membrane technology research who's currently building a large pilot that's being funded by the Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at about $60–70 million just from DOE. These systems, are really necessary to get to understand what it takes to actually integrate a full capture systems plant. This system that's funded by Fossil Energy will actually be operational next year. Hopefully OSED, Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, will have maybe, 5 to 10 of these operational in the United States in the next 4 or 5 years, and have many technology options for industry to choose from. CCS integrated demonstrations, a second part of this provision, 4104B, $2.5 billion to build fully integrated CCS demonstration programs. The legislation said 2 on coal, 2 on industrial, 2 on natural gas. There's so far 2 rounds of funding opportunity announcements. One was specifically just for feed studies for fully integrated demonstrations. Those were announced. I think a few have been awarded. Several are still under negotiation. And then the review of the second round, which was basically to get into projects that were further along their feeds, and the fully integrated construction and operation is still under review. Direct air capture. So hot topic, whether you agree with this or not, irrelevant, because there's a lot of money that DOE is putting into it and the federal government is appropriated for it. $3.5 billion to build 4 direct air capture hubs around the United States. Really starting to build kind of an ecosystem for DAC. The goal of each one of these hubs is to be able to inject up to 1 million tons a year by 2030. So it really is a long-term future for DAC, just starting the businesses, validating the technology, looking how these systems are going to operate in the future. If we need DAC, say in 2040, which a lot of the models show, to actually get to a net zero carbon economy. So there was 21 projects selected in August of this year, 2 full-scale DAC hubs, one in Louisiana, one in Texas, that'll actually move towards full operation, up to, I think, 500,000 to 1 million tons of CO2 into saline reservoirs. 5 design studies, 14 feasibility studies, one of them here in Wyoming, which would be good. I mean, again, I used to manage a carbon capture program, very interesting. If we need this technology, again, I always look at these things as an insurance policy. If a lot of the predictions are correct, we need a technology to deploy, and you probably need to start now if it's going to be needed in 15 or 20 years. So this is one of the programs that I managed while I was at DOE before I left. So I just borrowed this slide in whole because I developed it. It's a really interesting program. DOE had started the Carbon Safe program back in 2016 to start developing commercial storage facilities around the United States. Really didn't have the funding in the base program, which is the regular appropriations program, to fully construct these facilities. There was $2.5 billion basically to develop storage facilities around the United States in different basins to support the deployment of other capture and DAC systems. With this funding, it was designed, well, the program was originally designed to have 4 phases. First 2 is more on feasibility, and then phase 3 and phase 4 are really starting to do site construction of carbon safe facilities and getting to basically turnkey operations where you could start injection in a facility. With this funding, we predicted we could DOE predicted they could probably meet the needs for a storage industry to meet the net zero goals of the economy. So 20 to 40 facilities could be constructed just with this funding. Hundreds of wells will be permitted by 2030. represent about 2 to 3, maybe 4 billion tons of commercial storage capacity ready for operation. They so far selected 9 projects, $242 million invested, one of them here in Wyoming, which was the largest, $47.6 million total. Cost share, is a portion of that. So over $40 million coming to Wyoming to build a facility here in the Southwest United States, or Southwest part of the state. Round 2 applications under review. Hopefully they'll release a round 3 in Q2 of 2024, or fiscal year 2024, which would be January to March. And the idea was this was just going to be a rolling FOA through 2026, 2027 until all the funds are obligated, and then those projects would continue to construct these facilities through 2030, maybe a little bit beyond. Transport funding, another program that was under the division that I was managing at the time, Section 4303, which was $100 million. It was oddly named. It was actually named a carbon capture program, but the entire write-up was on the design and support of front-end engineering design studies for CO2 transport systems. The first round was only focused on pipeline systems. I think they picked 3, 1 backed out, so they ended up only having 2 projects. They've expanded the second opening to all barge or all freight transport, rail, truck, and ship. So they're expecting a lot more applications. I think there's already over 40, maybe $50 million available for the second round. And then the second piece is, it was under fossil energy and carbon management, but there's actually an MOU with the Loan Program Office to implement this. It was the CO2 Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. It's basically $2 billion of loan subsidies. So you can think about a loan subsidy as buying down the risk on a loan, similar to how you pay points on your house. So they could essentially support up to $25 billion in loans in the economy by just paying down the risk on the loans. There's a second component of this, which actually Fossil Energy and Carbon Management released about a month or 2, which is basically upsizing or future growth grants of facilities that were planned to be built. So if somebody is looking to build a pipeline system, they could apply for $200, $300, $400 million of grant money to actually oversize that pipeline for future growth grants. I don't think that that's closed yet, so I don't think anybody's applied at this point. Those are the main ones on carbon management that are related that I think Wyoming is really should be interested in. There are a number of other, like I said, funding opportunity announcements throughout the appropriations in the federal government that are probably relevant to Wyoming and some of the stakeholders, but may or may not be in DOE. Obviously, one is the IRS tax credit for 45Q and the 45V low hydrogen or low GHG hydrogen. When the bill was passed, we expected at DOE to be the major funder of CCS projects. 45V and 45Q kind of flipped that equation. And then I would say that the DOE funding is now just supplementing industrial investments because of the drivers of 45Q and 45V. The second is $9.7 billion in funds for rural development grants and loans out of the USDA. This is clean energy, but CCS and hydrogen were specifically called out in the legislation and the appropriations bills. This is the IRA. Enhancement to DOE loan program under IRA. Again, huge increase in funding, mostly for loans and loan subsidies, but authorization for up to another $250 billion in loan support. Low carbon building products, which I think is actually really interesting. There's procurement programs within DOT and GSA for low carbon building products, which you could take coal, gas, oil, take the CO2 out, make products that are low GHG and potentially qualify these. But you have to qualify these through the EPA, and I can't remember the like Energy Star program or similar. There's specific guidelines on how to qualify those products. And so that's kind of the infrastructure, everything I've talked about. But if you start looking at the annual appropriations and you start looking at all the offices within DOE and some of the other agencies, there is still a significant amount of annual appropriations that are dedicated to carbon management. Just the entire budget of fossil energy and carbon management is only dedicated to reduction of greenhouse gases, including methane and CO2, on developing technologies or projects to do that. There's carbon management requests through ARPA-E, Science, the EERE office, which is a $3 billion program. There's also the Undersecretary now for Infrastructure, which manages and oversees all the bill programs, even if they're in other offices. They have taken over a much larger piece of the industrial program, decarbonization program. And that's several $100 million just looking to help decarbonize industrial programs or industrial operations. And then there's cross-cutting working groups across the agency through all the departments I mentioned, or all of the offices I mentioned. But then there's probably 120 to 130 federal staff from all the headquarters, including IRS, EPA, all the ones I listed, DOT, that meet quarterly just to talk about coordination of CCS and other carbon management activities. As they develop rules, they develop leasing guidelines for federal lands and things like that. Hopefully the CEQ, as well will stand up its FACA groups, but you'll see a lot of these federal representatives on those FACA groups when they actually start. And then I'm just going to mention one last plug, EPAC 2020 authorization. The Wyoming SCR assumed operations and support for the Wyoming Integrated Test Center. It is really a good thing to actually fold that into SCR. We bring a lot of good capabilities to help that. But we're hopeful that there's an opportunity for funding for that facility as well. So you see the budgets for DOE going up significantly. You see the importance of places like the ITC up in Gillette, as more and more projects are coming to test on PRB coal as something that needs to be done and needs to be supported and successful. I think you're probably all aware, and if you're not, I'm just going to run through these quickly. Just the three big areas. One, the governor's energy matching fund, $150 million to cost share a lot of the infrastructure bills and federal programs, which is necessary. If we don't have the federal cost, we don't have the cost share from the state, you're not going to be able to apply for some of these funding opportunity announcements from the federal government. Bonds in terms of $3 billion for transmission lines, pipeline, export facilities, all may be necessary if you're building hydrogen products or ammonia or something else to ship out to your neighboring states that are demanding low carbon projects. And then 2023 state energy program grants. Again, I'm not an expert in these, but I just review them on WEA's website. But they all look to be very supportive of, building out an industry that you're probably going to need for the products that Wyoming wants to continue to make. And then my last few comments, I know I'm getting close on time, is on community benefits plans. So with the passage of the BIL, you would have noticed that it probably took us a little bit longer to get those funding opportunity announcements out on the street. One of those was because community benefits plans were required. But the problem is they didn't have the infrastructure to help define what was needed in those community benefits plans. So it took a little while to actually work with what I would say is the environmental justice communities in the White House and DOE working internally to build that capability to come up with what they thought was necessary. The reason why it's important is because it's 20% of the score of all applications now within the federal government, not just for the infrastructure projects, but also for the base programs. So it's basically pervasive throughout the entire department. You'll probably see this. They've mentioned it. They want to make this a requirement through all the agencies. But there's really four elements of this: community and labor engagement, investing in jobs in the United States, investing in America's workforce, diversity, economic inclusion and accessibility, making sure that hiring practices are fair, and implementing the Justice 40 initiative, which has been defined in a number of executive orders on what that means. Basically, 40% of the funds or the investment needs to go to Justice 40 communities, not by project, but by agency. So I think that's a very important distinction, just to make sure that you understand that. Agencies are required to roll that up and say, this is all our investments in the Justice 40 initiative. It's harder for projects like CCS to do that. It's easier for programs like energy subsidies and subsistence to poor communities to do that. So there are specialized teams reviewing these. A number of social scientists have been hired into the department. They're overseeing them. They're making sure they're up to snuff. And if there's changes need to be made, they're monitoring them on a quarterly basis to make sure they're being implemented. One of the important things is I have not heard of nor seen, and I've talked to a few people, there is no authorization or appropriations for this. This has just been implemented by executive order. And so if you're interested, I've listed all the executive orders that have come out of the White House on this. And you can read through those. I mean, it is really been pushed by the administration. So, you know, as they push it down into the agencies, I'll just make a personal comment, you know, with a change in administration, you know, these kind of things are changed fairly quickly. Not that it's not important, and I don't think they would vacate all of these things. But it's important to know that there is no specific authorization appropriations that I'm aware of that authorizes these. But executive orders are very strong. So this is why it's being done. Some of the things to note, you know, they don't require some of these they do. Apprenticeship program, minority institution consideration, community benefits agreements, community workforce agreements. I mean, I won't read all of these, but if you read in between the lines, some of these are not required because by law, DOE is not necessarily allowed to require that a labor agreement be required in an agreement. That is a sensitive subject. And I would say, if you want to talk to somebody, talk to a labor attorney and have them talk to an authorization attorney that understands federal authorizations. That's all I'll say on that. So don't take that these have to be developed. DOE explicitly says on their websites, they won't even get involved in some of these agreements, but they encourage these agreements to exist. So, that's all I had. I hope that's useful. So I will only be here until Monday. I'm taking a job with industry, and I want to say for Holly, I thank her so much for giving me the opportunity to work for the university. It has been an absolute joy. I owe her free consulting for as long as I live in Wyoming, which I hope will be forever. But I really do appreciate that opportunity. So if there's any questions, happy to take a question.
Oh, thank you so much for your presentation. I just want to ask just a question. Obviously, CCUS is such an innovative technology when it comes to addressing climate change and all that. My question is, what is the UX plan to export this technology, especially to the developing economies for the sake of the Paris Agreement?
Great question. So I was not in the international group, but we would support them with lots of policy papers while I was there. There is a significant amount of work, and I don't remember all the acronyms, but from the secretary's level, John Kerry and others, to work with developing countries as well as more developed countries to talk about the role of CCS and carbon management. I don't know, and I wish I could answer, like trade organizations, commerce, and others would all be involved in helping support the export of these technologies. They're all involved in those discussions. They spend a significant amount of time. When I was there, our assistant secretary was probably on the road to international countries 50% of the time or more, talking about carbon management and the things that we're doing in the United States. So great question. Don't have a detailed answer for you, but I know it's extremely important. So.
And we'll take one last question here.
Thank you. And thank you for coming. How do you see all of these initiatives and all of the money behind them as it relate to the rising tide of opposition across the country to CO2 pipelines and CO2 sequestration?
Yep, another great question. So I think, you know, in my view, you could look at energy development in general as having opposition. I mean, you look at wind turbines in Wyoming, and I'll just give you a view sheds. You talk about opacity, you pass a wind turbine farm and it's going to have opposition because the blocking view sheds. I would say it's not just unique to CO2. I think CO2 gets a highlight because there's still a narrative out there that it's only enabling fossil energy systems, and it's not. That narrative needs to go away because it truly is enabling all these other systems to deploy and meet net zero goals, but you're not going to get away from opposition from local communities. So yeah, it's a challenge. It's going to be a challenge to build out at the scale that we're talking about. Yeah, thanks.